Joining us now for more on the 2020 race is Mercedes Schlapp, an advisor of the 2020 Trump campaign. Mercedes, we now know that Joe Biden is going to be the presumptive Democratic nominee. He's the only one left in the race right now. Does his candidacy pose different challenges than maybe what would have been seen with the Senator Bernie Sanders candidacy?
And whether it would have been Biden or Bernie Sanders, what we do know is that it was the Democrats who have made this decision to uplift this establishment candidate, despite the fact that his policies are very much in line with Bernie Sanders' radical agenda. So we are not concerned. It's almost like going against the same person.
And I think it's worth pointing out, too, that even though Joe Biden is looked at as more the centrist candidate, he's running on the most progressive agenda in modern presidential history. I mean, what he's saying right now, just 10 years ago, would have been considered to be extreme. So I think looking at the political environment of where we are now kind of shows the development within the Democratic Party. But a big concern for the Biden campaign is not repeating the mistakes of the Clinton campaign, where a lot of supporters of Senator Bernie Sanders refused to come out for her. Do you think that there's a home in the Republican movement, the Trump movement, for those supporters of Senator Sanders?
Absolutely. I think it's going to be very difficult for Joe Biden to unite this fractured party. Remember, one of the issues that Bernie Sanders supporters care about is the issue of trade. And so when you look at Joe Biden is your ultimate globalist. He's the one that supported NAFTA, he supported TPP. He's the one who's been very cozy with China. And so I think that's very much a stark contrast to where we see President Trump, who has taken these trade deals, renegotiated them, despite what the critics were saying, that he wasn't going to get it done. And we've ended up with better trade deals today between Mexico and Canada. And then, of course, the phase one trade deal with China. We knew that was very important because China has taken advantage of us for far too long. And so I think you're going to see that it's Joe Biden being the anti-worker candidate versus President Trump, who has focused on helping American workers and really build a strong economy, obviously, before we hit the coronavirus.
And even to that point, it's a matter of who do you trust handling the economy coming out of a crisis. We could look back to 2008 and the Obama administration, their anemic growth coming out of 2008. You know that's going to be used against Joe Biden. And of course, all the Trump administration has to say is before this outbreak, we had the best economy in U.S. history. So right there, you can see already the arguments that are going to be taking place. And to your point about trade, President Trump said that back in 2016, he was hoping that Hillary Clinton would not pick Senator Bernie Sanders as his VP because he saw him as the biggest threat. They kind of overlap on different things when it comes to trade. So now when Joe Biden is looking for his VP now, does it matter who he picks? Does that change the strategy at all for the Trump campaign?
I can tell you, just based on political history, and I've worked on several presidential campaigns, usually the VP does not necessarily sway voters in a certain direction. I think that at the end of the day, they want to know who the president is going to be. And, you know, the vice president obviously plays a very important supporting role. But I think at the end of the day, we are not concerned about who he picks as a vice presidential candidate. You know, I think for Joe Biden, he just has such obvious weaknesses. There is no Joe Biden movement like you saw with Bernie Sanders, or you look at President Trump. I mean, it is truly a movement when you look at the president's supporters, the enthusiasm behind President Trump. That does not exist with Joe Biden. There is an enthusiastic gap between those two candidates, and clearly President Trump is leading in terms of ensuring that his supporters are active. They're getting out the vote, and we're doing what we can to ensure that we stay in a strong position from the campaign's perspective.
And even when it comes to Joe Biden, we heard comedian and podcast host Joe Rogan say earlier this week that he wouldn't vote for Joe Biden over President Trump. Joe Rogan is a self-proclaimed progressive, but he says that it'll be Biden's cabinet making the decisions because he doesn't trust Joe Biden when it comes to his cognitive abilities. It's something that's maybe a little taboo to talk about in the media right now, but just a few weeks ago when Joe Biden was struggling in the polls, it wasn't as taboo. So acknowledging that point, why hasn't President Barack Obama yet come out and endorsed Joe Biden?
You know, that's an excellent question. I mean, you would think they've gone through so many candidates, and President Obama has been quiet throughout this whole entire process, not necessarily giving Joe Biden that huge support that he would need. So I think it's very problematic for Joe Biden. I think that at this point, the Democrats are trying to figure out how can you bring all those factions together. I do think that the Sanders voters are very weary and really they don't trust Joe Biden because they know that he at the end of the day he is the swamp. He is a stale Washingtonian status quo politician that has done very little during his time in office and has flip flopped on a number of issues. I mean, you just see recently where the president put travel restrictions on China because of the coronavirus, and Biden criticized the president. Then you saw a couple weeks ago Biden saying, yes, actually, we should put travel restrictions on China. So I just think that for Biden, you talk about one gaffe after the other. You look at his record where it's a job killing policies that he supports, like the Green New Deal. I just think that it's going to be very difficult for him to bring along those Sanders supporters. And I think those people will look at Donald Trump as an alternative.
And even when you go down Joe Biden's record, too, a lot of the positions that he held in the past are not positively supported right now by the American people. You mentioned NAFTA before. You could go to the Iraq War. You could go to cutting Social Security. All of these issues, he now supports the right side of history, but at the time, he was on the wrong side of history. So I think he's going to have a hard time explaining that one, too, to the American people. But Mercedes Schlapp, I really appreciate you coming on, breaking down the 2020 race for us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex.